All right. Well, with that, I would like to hand this over to Dr. Scott Moody. He's going to talk about endangered species of amphibians, and we're incredibly pleased to have him here tonight.
Okay. Hey, we timed this just perfectly. You know what's going to happen tomorrow? You know what's happening today? All those frogs and salamanders are just sticking their noses out. They're sensing the increasing of temperature. Their bodies are no longer frozen under the frozen soil. Warm rain is going to trickle in tomorrow. And actually, they started getting those cues several weeks ago as the days were getting longer and longer, and that started to trigger their hormones. So the eggs are already produced. The males are producing sperm. Tomorrow will be the beginning of all of the choreographing of behaviors and sounds in the part of the frogs so that those sperm and eggs can get together. Got to make the next generation. So I've condensed about 6 hours worth of lecture into a small and fast little talk that I can give, so then we can look at some of the living organisms. I definitely first want to thank ODNR Division of Wildlife and the Ohio Biological Survey that's provided grant funding to me over the years for some of my research on endangered species. So a basic outline of what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is address the question, what is endangered? Why are these particular amphibian species endangered? Who are endangered? And then we'll actually address some of the unscientific decision making in terms of who is legally endangered and who I would say legitimately should be listed and protected as endangered. Then we're going to move into getting you to realize the kind of drastic changes to the environment of Ohio, particularly here in southeast Ohio, over the last 200 years. Life was so much better for these amphibians 200 years ago than it is today. And so then I'm going to address new causes of endangerment, not the habitat loss, not the fact that in the case of some species, people would eat them. I'm going to talk about some insidious new causations of endangerment that we as humans have dropped upon the poor amphibians. And then get you to realize, hey, it's not impacting just the frogs. It's impacting you and me and your families and your grandchildren down the end. So protecting what are they doing back there? Protecting the frogs is very important to ultimately protecting us. So extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened. What does that mean? Yeah, that's me a long time ago. And I was working with the spade-footed toad. I don't have any living specimens. I have a preserved specimen. At that point, I was afraid that maybe all of the spade-foot toads of Ohio would be of the Smucker's preserved mason jar variety. But I'll tell you more about them in a minute. So extirpated are at a local level, and that can be a political unit like a county or a state, are the populations actually no longer there. They had been there historically, but then they're wiped out. So that's extirpated is at the local geographic level. Extinct means the entire species. That entire biological species is gone, like the passenger pigeon, like the Carolina parakeet, totally gone. Then endangered and threatened are kind of two levels. Level 1, level 2 of the probability, the chance that these populations or the species will become extinct. So a native species is, if it's imminently going to be extirpated from a political unit, or perhaps as a whole species go extinct, that's definitely endangered. Threatened is just kind of a, the little bit less, but there's a danger of it becoming endangered and then going extinct. So right now, the amphibians that are considered endangered for the state of Ohio, there's several salamanders and only one frog. So hellbender, the blue-spotted salamander, cave salamander, green salamander, and Worley's salamander. And the one I'm going to talk about in a minute is the hellbender, because the hellbender used to be very common in the Hocking River. In fact, Ohio University's mascot should not be the bobcat. It should be a hellbender, because they were right over there at White's Mill. I didn't look to see where this particular specimen came from, but several were found in the Hocking River. It's the largest salamander in North America, and a very special one indeed. Sure. It's only the same sort of alcohol that you find up on Court Street, so it won't hurt you. So here's a picture of what's being passed around. Its relative is actually this guy, 5-6 feet long, 80 pounds. That's the giant salamander of Japan. So ours only get to be, that's a good sized one, so 30 inches or so is pretty typical. The reason why they have such wrinkly skin is that's where they are actually respiring. So the carbon dioxide is leaving the body through the skin. The oxygen is being absorbed by lots and lots of blood vessels that are found in that folded skin. So if you actually would skin a hellbender and stretch out the skin, it would probably cover even greater surface area of the table, and that's how they extract the oxygen from the river. And for those of you who've walked under the Richland Avenue Bridge, I've been trying to get a good photograph, but that mural, that raised relief mural, I mean, you can see like the great blue heron, and you can see a bunch of fish. There's a turtle in there. There's a deer off. But there is the hellbender right there. I'm very happy. I kept pressuring the city to make certain that the hellbender was included in there. So hellbenders are found in predominantly the mountainous, hilly regions, but historically were found anywhere in Ohio in a stream or river that drained into the Ohio River. And you can see all of these collecting spots that date back 100 years or so. A lot of surveys show that, yes, we can pick up old adults here and there, but over the years, only one place has been documented to have a population where there are reproducing adults, and it's right there. And so we're putting a lot of effort into this particular locality and taking fertilized eggs. And right now the Wilds, the Ogilvy Zoo, and the Toledo Zoo are all head-starting youngsters to be grow up to a larger size. After about 2 years, they can be released back into Captina Creek, and hopefully we can get the population growing again. Okay, let's quickly look at some of the other endangered species legally considered endangered. I think it's pretty obvious that hellbender's endangered. Look at this broad distribution, reproducing in only one stream. That's close to extirpation. But what about this one, the little blue-spotted salamander? considered endangered in Ohio because it's only found from one locality. Is it the same situation as the hellbender? Well, not really. That one locality is way up there north of Toledo. And the rest of the species is widespread in the Great Lakes, New England, Canada. It's actually one of the most common salamanders in Canada, perhaps even the most common vertebrate. We're talking about a biomass that would be almost incalculable. Is it endangered? Of course not. Just because it just hits the northern boundary of Ohio. Political boundaries are completely arbitrary. They mean nothing to species or biology. So I always argue against that, the inclusion of that salamander is endangered. Yeah, it's rare because it's only historically only been found there. It's not that we have taken away habitat. It's just that it's inside the, I mean, if back in that war in the 1800s when Michigan and Ohio had a little brief war up there, if Michigan had won, then we wouldn't even have that salamander in the state. So here's another one, cave salamander. A salamander that's found in limestone caves and springs all throughout the Appalachians, and particularly Tennessee and Kentucky, and it just barely gets into Ohio. There's only a couple of places where there's sufficient habitat that they can live in. It's not that they used to be found everywhere in Ohio and we kind of wiped out habitat. No, it's an accident of where we put political borders. I mean, that's absurd. And the same with the green salamander, absolutely beautiful salamander. This is one that has the green flecks so that it can remain camouflaged on rocks, wet rocks that have a lot of moss and lichens. And it too is fairly common throughout the Appalachians, just barely gets across the Ohio River into the right kind of habitat. The rest of the state doesn't have that right kind of habitat. So we only find them in 3 counties right here. You know, if Kentucky owned the bottom half here, no one would be excited. But you know, it gets considered endangered. Now let's look at some candidates of other salamanders that legitimately should be listed as legally endangered, like the tiger salamander. And I've got one. Yeah, here's the tiger salamander up here, a live one, and look at its distribution. It's all over the place. In Ohio, it's out here in the flatland areas, but we don't find living tiger salamanders as frequently in Ohio anymore, because any of you who've either grew up in this part of the state or traveled through that part of the state, this is cornfield soybeans from horizon to horizon, and a tremendous amount of impact from the farming, the draining of marshes and wetlands, and the increasing impact of herbicides. So here's one where, look, we had lots of localities and now we're only finding them in a few localities. Why isn't it considered legally an endangered species? Same with the spring salamanders. Now these guys are going to be in the hilly part of Ohio, and they're common throughout the Appalachians, and we've got lots and lots of localities, but in a few minutes I'm going to show you what the forest should look like. This was probably one of the most abundant salamanders you could find anywhere. So we've reduced its numbers down drastically as well, but because, well, we can find them here, we can find them there, then nobody seems to be worried about them. I'm more worried in the dynamic of going from billions of individuals down to maybe a few thousand individuals. And the same with the mud salamander. It's only found here in southern Ohio, and a lot of these records, the solid circles, are records from before 1950, and the triangles are from 1950 to 1988. Recent surveys could only find them in about 4 places. That should be, hey, we've got a problem here. But no one seems to want to give them the legal attention. One frog, as an example, is the Blanchard's cricket frog. It's our tiniest frog in the state, and its distribution is quite extensive as a species. And Ohio is basically the western half of the state. What's the habitat? Corn and soybeans again. And unfortunately, the numbers here have gone probably from trillions down to fewer and fewer localities are recording cricket frogs. Now, here's my favorite. This is the one I've done quite a bit of research on, one poor preserved specimen. And when you see this, you can see these little sharp digging spade on the hind foot, which is why it's called a spade foot. It digs quite successfully. I was asked by ODNR in 1986 to see if I could find more populations, because this guy had not been seen anywhere in the state for years and years. Guess where it was originally seen in the state? Where it was the first population described in a science journal. Athens, Ohio, 1943. That was the first population that was ever found. It's extirpated, gone. And then a couple of other people had found two other populations back in the 40s and 50s, and then nothing. So that's why ODNR asked me can you find more? So here I come, 87 to 89, Belpre, down towards Parkersburg. In the 1990s, Reno, which is near Marietta. And then actually in the lower part of the Hocking River, down around Frost and Coolville, find lots of populations. Then up the Muskingum River in Morgan County, and then a few years later I found a large population down in Meigs County. So we went from one or couple populations to finally they were finding them elsewhere. So where's the spot in Athens? Well, Sears is now down there. This is a muffler. Is it Monroe muffler behind Ponderosa? So I'm standing over by Ponderosa. All of the shopping mall on East State Street was right on top of the original Ohio University airport. So the runway used to be up and down, and there was a lot of ponds on either side. So that's where they originally were. And the first new population I found was down in Belpre, and there it was a field, had plenty of habitat, and then the whole thing got covered over with houses. So that led me to rescuing as many of those spadefoots. Actually rescued tadpoles, raised up the tadpoles, about 15,000 of them. So this is 1987. My son Seth and I were basically sowing the spadefoots into an appropriate new habitat, same soil, same type vegetation in eastern Athens County. So in the end result, we went from like 1 or 2 populations, which definitely says imminent danger of extirpation, and then with knowing how to look for them, being able to concentrate activity on the right kind of habitats, which I had figured out, and then we start picking them up from Lawrence County and Meigs County and then all the way up into the Tuscarawas River as well. And there's undoubtedly some more populations as well. So is it no longer endangered? Well, that's still not too many populations. And we certainly want to protect them from like any more factories being built or shopping malls and so on. So there's me surveying one of the populations. But yes, I'm still concerned about spadefoots and their future as well. Many of you who are a few years older than a typical student, if you remember back 1989, 1990, will remember lots and lots of media coverage on the fact that amphibians, and particularly frogs, were going extinct around the world. So books were written about it. Even the New York Times Magazine had a huge article on this. Newspaper headlines screamed, frogs might be the canary in the coal mine and give us warning that there's environmental doom around the corner. And at that time, everybody was arguing, oh, it's acid rain, it's global warming, it's all these things. Well, it turned out that what was happening, there's the culprit right there. And that culprit's swimming around in here. Now, that particular one didn't cause all this destruction. But this is the African clawed frog from Africa that has actually become quite a pest, an alien species introduced into different parts of the United States, but particularly California, but also dumped in rivers in Europe and Australia, etc. And it turned out that it was carrying with it a pathogen, a Chytrid species, a type of a fungus that had never been described before scientifically. We didn't even know what it was. In Africa, the frogs have co-evolved with this pathogen for such a long time that Xenopus, it doesn't even get sick when it's infected, but it's a total disaster to other frogs on other continents. So why was this frog being dumped everywhere around the world? Well, back when your grandmother or great-grandmother was wondering whether or not she was pregnant, she would go visit the doctor and they'd get a urine sample, and they would take the urine and inject it into female African clawed frogs, and if the frog would start yolking up eggs saying, hey, where's the male so I can mate? I'm making eggs. That was the indicator that the human female was pregnant. She wasn't pregnant, the hormones weren't present in the urine, and then the frog wouldn't develop eggs. Well, the medical labs went on to develop easier and more accurate tools. So what do you do with these frogs? Oops, they get chucked out into the nearby streams and ponds. Very unfortunate. And so that has now been shown to be the cause for this worldwide extirpation and extinction of many, many species of frogs. Not happening in Ohio, fortunately. This tends to be more in the mountainous regions and in the tropics. So a poor frog that does become infected, it looks like the skin is about ready to peel off, and it's all yucky, basically. And there's these are all aquatic, and then there's a life cycle for this particular type of parasite. And if you want to learn more about this, all you got to do is type in frogs, the thin green line. You can stream this for free, 50-minute documentary from PBS. Okay, what about cane toads? Here's the good old cane toad. scientific name Bufo-marinus or marinus. The marine toad was the original name. Marine toad? Amphibians live in the ocean in a marine environment? No way. But this is actually a rather small marine toad. Linnaeus named it. The originator for animal classification named it Bufo-marinus. It originally comes from areas like Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala. And for some reason, the notes that came in with whoever sent him the specimen said they collected it in the Atlantic Ocean of Panama. And of course, they don't live in salt water. Back in the 1930s, this species was imported. They brought in several dozen to Queensland, Australia, because they were losing a lot of the sugar cane crop to sugar cane beetles. And the larvae said, oh, big voracious toad, will come in and eat all of the beetles and the larvae. Except the cane toad said, I'm not going to live in there with all the sugar cane. Turned around and went out in the bush and has been responsible since 1930 with several dozen extinctions of small marsupial mammals, as lizards, as snakes, and native amphibians of Australia. So I threw this in simply because we had a live specimen. I wanted to see that. Now, I want you to think about what did this place look like 200 years ago? And this is information that Milton Troutman, who wrote The Fishes of Ohio, had compiled a number of years ago in documenting that in 1750 to the early 1800s, most of Ohio was covered with forest, and there was highland, upperland forest, there was lowland forest, there were marshy areas, there was a tremendous amount of aquatic habitat in Ohio. I mean, it was an amphibian paradise. Here's a map of the original vegetation of Ohio from about 200 years ago. And then realize that in the 1800s, right up to the end of the Civil War, virtually all trees were cut down. The state looked like a moonscape. And here's some old pictures just from the Wayne National Forest showing hillsides right around Athens. There barely aren't any trees, maybe in the deep ravines and along the rivers and so on. So the Wayne National Forest got founded because during the Depression in the 1930s, a lot of the farmers who had been trying to farm this highly eroded land weren't making a living, so the federal government bought up the land, and here they are planting the trees back. But here's what I want you to try to imagine 200 years ago, walking around in the woodland, bouncing up and down on this soft, spongy topsoil, 3, 4, 5 foot of what you buy in a sack called potting soil today, that real nice fluffy black stuff. I mean, that's the way the soil around here was. And it kept soil erosion at a minimum. When there was heavy rains or the big melt of the snows and ice like we're having right now, it was all absorbed by this big sponge, and this let out gradually into the streams and rivers. So all these little springs and brooks were flowing with nice clean water year-round. Now we see these streams in the winter and early spring, and then they're dry from probably May to December. Not good for the amphibians. And all the comments from the different explorers back in the 1800s would comment about the constancy of flow. Springs would be available to provide water for the early settlers and so on. If you go into the Ohio River, there was nice clean sandbanks, and and gravel places for the different species of fish. And Hildreth wrote that the Native Americans never had to take food with them on any journeys because the fish were so abundant that it would only take a few minutes just to get lunch or supper. Huge numbers and diversity of fish. That was the habitat that this hellbender was living in. Clean water, no dissolved soil, otherwise known as silt. The oxygen level was high in the water. So no wonder it's been extirpated from nearly all of the rivers. So 1960s was the big push for environmentalism, kind of sparked by a book by Rachel Carson, a book I read in high school when it first came out, known as Silent Spring. It's a book that I think all college students should read. And believe it or not, in the early 70s, everybody remembers President Nixon as the guy who was a crook, but he was probably the best environmental president we've ever had, maybe even better than Theodore Roosevelt. He started the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He's the one who pushed for the endangered species legislation. And he understood, all politicians back then, it didn't matter what your political party or allegiance was, we realized that protecting the environment is good for everybody. It should not be a political issue, and unfortunately today it's become a political issue. Now let's shift gears a little bit and try to tie this in with the final conclusion today. Over the last 60, 70 years, once we've got good epidemiological data from the medical schools, from the Centers for Disease Control, it's quite clear that in humans, we're seeing an upward trend of reproductive tract abnormalities, fertility problems, bronchial asthma, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, type 1 diabetes, cancers, especially reproductive organs, cardiovascular diseases, autism, ADHD, depression, bipolar disease, binging, anorexia, bulimia, all been increasing. Something in the environmental background is most likely pushing this. We've also realized that many of the chemicals, and realized since the 1950s, has been the invention and release of thousands of different kind of chemicals, the plastics industry in particular, many common chemicals that have been developed for industry and for our own homes are known as endocrine disruptors. For some reason, the molecular structure of many of these causes the same signaling of animal cells that estrogen would signal. And we've got lots of data on fish and amphibians, turtles, alligators, and humans as well. So again, with an impact on the endocrine system, then you can start impacting the thyroid and fertility and even demasculization or defemination, the decreasing survivorship of offspring, and altered immune response. So a lot of man-made chemicals are doing this, affecting the amphibians because they're in an aqueous and aquatic habitat, and then humans too. We're drinking the water that contains a lot of these trace chemicals. In the last several years, a lot of studies working through and looking at the statistics. I mean, it's quite clear that the herbicides and insecticides are having a huge impact. And one of the reasons we're so concerned about chemicals used in the fracking industry, I mean, the claim that, you just pump it down 6,000 feet, it's not going to get into the water supply. This is a recent report just out earlier this week. nonsense. I mean, ultimately, it will reach the water supply. So this woman, Dr. Colburn, has been one to keep up with all of the research and summarize it. Many of you are probably familiar with Erin Brockovich. We brought her to OU several years ago as a Kennedy lecturer. And I'm going to end on one of the most insidious of chemicals, which is atrazine, the #1 herbicide used on those corn fields and soybean fields. And remember back when I was pointing out that the frog populations in all these states have been crashing just in the last 20 years. The correlation with atrazine is high. So that's where I put in a plug. Here's our Frontiers in Science speaker. This will be March 24th over at Memorial Auditorium. From Silent Spring to Silent Night, a tale of toads and men. Write that down. Be sure to come to this lecture. Here's the man, an endocrinologist from University of California, Berkeley, who's done the most seminal research on this topic, and it's been reaffirmed by a lot of other labs. So let me run through a little cartoon here, and I'm going to try to read this by changing things, because we're not talking about rats today, we're talking about frogs. So this is the frog that ran around Jack's house. This is the poison, herbicides, atrazine, that killed the rat that ran around at Jack's house. This is the raccoon that ate the frog, killed by the herbicides that were spread on the agricultural fields around Jack's house. This is the mountain lion that ate the raccoon that ate the frog, killed by the herbicide that was all around Jack's house. This is the painful death of the mountain lion that ate the raccoon that ate the frog, killed by the herbicides that was all around Jack's house. These are the deer with no threat of a mountain lion that ate the raccoon that ate the frog, killed by herbicide and the frogs that eat all the insects, and even a lot of the insects that farmers don't want consuming their crops around Jack's house. This is the mudslide from the hills denuded by deer that faced no mountain lion that ate the raccoon that ate the frog, killed by the herbicides that messed up Jack's house. And instead of the new rat is going to be replacing the frog. So now we got even worse pests, the kind that we don't want, that ran around in all the fresh muck at Jack's house. Everything is connected. So if we don't protect the amphibians, ultimately we get a complete disruption of the community ecology, comes back and hits us in the behind, and certainly with diseases and so on. You want another little cartoon? Yeah. Okay. This one is titled, "I've Got the Greens, Baby." My babies left my lily pad. My legs were both deep fried. I eat flies all day, and when I'm gone, they'll stick me in formaldehyde. Oh, I've got the greens real bad. Thank you. Yes.
What made you decide to study this area? What was your inspiration?
Because, okay, she wants to know why I study endangered species of frogs, amphibians, and so on. Well, actually, it's life is a series of contingencies. You know, I did not grow up in Ohio. And my great love was actually lizards and snakes, reptiles. But 1979, I applied to 50 places for a job as a professor. Interviewed at 3 and was accepted here at Ohio University. So, contingency. I actually was hired by the medical school to teach the medical students, but then 5 years later, the person who taught herpetology, was amphibians and reptiles, retired, and so I took over also teaching in addition to anatomy to the medical students, a herpetology class. So I figured, well, I guess I better find what's interesting in the area, and spadefoot toads caught my fancy.
I just have a quick question. So if someone 200 years ago was swimming, by where White's Mill is, and
You could see to the bottom.
wow, I was wondering if they swam by a hellbender, whether or not it would like bite.
Oh, no, they're not aggressive. The hellbenders, you want to know if these guys are aggressive. So that if you went over to White's Mill and was jumping around in the rapids over there, they hide under the big rocks that are in the river, so they're under the crevices, and little fish that come swimming in, they open up their mouth and suck them in. They only got tiny little teeth that are actually not biting or anything. So now, if you are trying to catch them, they can try to defend themselves, but no, they're not snappy individuals. It was difficult to actually find these guys in these rivers because, one, the rivers are no longer nice crystal clear waters, and they're yuck and you can't see anything. And so the technique has always been to hold your breath and go down under the water and jam your arms up and under these rocks. Then several years ago, a student was working with Greg Lips, who works for ODNR, and he said, well, my dad is an electrician. Didn't you know that you can actually take this little camera and have a flexible long wand and a lens and a light at the end? They drill a hole. If you don't know where the electrical wiring is in the wall of the house, you can stick that in there and snake it around. Oh, there's where the electric is, and then be able to go get it. Hey, now you can stand outside of the water and someone sticks the lens under the rocks and poke it back in there, and you can easily see the whether or not somebody's home or not, or whether or not there's a cluster of eggs. These guys actually coil around the eggs and protect them from predators and so on. So that's how they're actually capturing the fertilized, developing eggs and then taking them to the zoos to head start them. It's using that electrician's tool.
I think I speak for everybody. We always hear all these claims about things going on in the world. One of my favorite people, Bill Nye, always says, do everything all at once. If you had a message for the American masses of something we can change in our daily lives to help us, what would it be?
Actually, there was a reporter here asking me, talking to me before I started, and asked a very similar one. So this is very important. So I already was thinking about it. What can you do? Do things with, I can't get it out, your wallet. What are you buying? And particularly with food. Right now in North America, the problem isn't the fungus. The problem is the atrazine and the Roundup and the Rodeo, these herbicides. Buy organic food. Demand that all companies switch over to crops that are not bathed with billions, and I'm not exaggerating, billions of tons of atrazine every year. So if we can just start getting the message out to stop the use of herbicides in all this corn and soybean fields, that would go a great way. But we've seen such dramatic drops in the amphibian populations just in the last 20 years. And we're now documenting the impact of those same herbicides on human health, and that was why the title for my talk.
So is there any specific thing we should look for, like packaging wise?
Well, it's how the agricultural crops are growing. I mean, you want minimal use of the herbicides. I wouldn't say the packaging so much. Is that?
I have two questions.
Mhm.
On your map of the ashes you, Nevada was completely black. Is it illegal there?
I don't know. You know? There's not much agriculture out there. So that's the main reason. Or it may have been a lack of data. Second question?
A common salamander that looks similar to the cave salamander this year?
She wants to know that beautiful, bright reddish orange cave salamander. Is there a look-alike in the Athens area? Another species that's closely related to it is known as the long-tailed salamander. And it's not as brilliant red and orange, but it's definitely got a predominance of yellowish orange color. And it's got little tiger-like bars on the tail.
If for some reason one of us might have found one of these, is there a number we can call?
Like a rare salamander. Or
I don't know what situation that would happen, but if there is, what would we do?
Okay, she's asking if you actually find a rare amphibian species and wish to report it, who to report it to ODNR, Division of Wildlife. And you don't
And also, did you name any of your specimens?
name them? No. Years ago, when I used to do a lot of snake programs for mainly little kids, I would put names on because little kids always want to have the names. But no,
So when you are going to go and look for all the different species of frogs that were starting in a significant area, how did you go about looking for them?
question is, how do you find the frogs? Well, the good thing about frogs is, ribbit, weep, 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 brrr. They're all acoustical. So during the breeding season, the males are making the sounds to defend territories and attract females and so on. So about 20 years ago, we started frog calling surveys on a lot of high schools and a lot of naturalists and a lot of just citizens would actually be assigned a particular 15-mile route and take a tape recorder out and it was amazing how much new information that we got. Some counties where we didn't know that a particular species lived, we finally found documentation. Salamanders, they don't have any voice. It's back-breaking work. You go through the woods and you look under rocks and you look under logs. During the breeding part of the season, they'll be in the pools and so on. So you got to have dip nets or larger nets, but it takes a lot of work. That's
How long is it about going out on the roads this time of year to look for the
Yeah. Well, that's what's going to happen tomorrow night. The relatives of the tiger salamander. We've got two here in this area. One known as Jefferson's salamander. It's a large gray, bluish gray salamander. The other being the spotted salamander, a beautiful salamander. They're the ones that are going to emerge out of all the woodlands in the hills, probably tomorrow night, and they're going to go back to the pool where they were born. And it might be a quarter-mile away. And they're going to have to cross roads. And they get smashed up all the time, unfortunately. So tomorrow night or any wet, rainy night in February, March, if you're driving the local roads and you happen to say, what's that? It looks like a pencil, a number 2 pencil crawling across the road. Stop and look, and it's probably a Jefferson salamander or a spotted salamander.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
That's because of skin.
Right, exactly.
Don't they actually have anatomies that are kind of similar to humans?
Oh, yeah, they're vertebrates. There's not.
But, like, don't they use it for dissection, animal testing? So, like, they are kind of similar, like, in effects. Are they kind of similar in effects to what would happen to a human?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, that's, there's not that much difference between a human and a frog and a salamander as far as like all the hormones. And you get all these chemicals that cause the same response that normal hormones. Yeah, that's a big point. Yeah.
How is the fungus spread from frog to frog?
It's in the water. It's waterborne fungus.
Of the new populations of the spadefoot, how many of those were discovered and how many of those were populations that you were starting?
Most of those were completely unknown to anybody until I discovered them or Jeff Davis had discovered them. Yeah, so it wasn't.
What happened with the seeding? Did the seeding work?
It needs to be tested. They did not remain in that same field. As you remember back where I was tossing out the toadlets. That's about 8 miles east of Athens. The following year, the Hocking River flooded to the extent that West Green did have an ankle-high water. Like it went over the control banks. East State Street was closed for I think 4 days, and that where I sowed them out was under 10 feet of rushing water. And it's interesting that 4 years later, downstream by Coolville, all of a sudden I'm finding spadefoots that I had never found before. And I had checked there for years before. So I think yes, it worked, but they got moved downstream. The only way to prove it is, try to convince Dr. Kuchta to actually test the genomes. But I think they are the Belprey spadefoots. Yeah, which one?
After EPA being formed, what do you think the most important thing is done for the conservation of the amphibians in this area?
What should be done?
What's the
Or
most important thing that has to be done, or has been
what
done?
has been done? Nothing. Who'd I go?
Probably one. Take the last one. Or the last two. How about that?
Okay.
Is there a correlation between pathogens that are killing the frogs and salamanders in this area and the ones in the reservoirs?
We are not having the pathogens affecting our frogs and salamanders.
But it's carrion, right? The one that invaded this area?
No, not yet. Let's hope it doesn't happen. It's probably not because it's usually the more montane. So where it's in the United States had an impact has been the Sierra Mountains and Rocky Mountains, but not in Ohio. But,
That's our last one.
Mark.
Which amphibian in Ohio are you most concerned about regarding being endangered?
To really totally, I would say the cricket frog. I mean, it has probably taken a 99.9% nosedive in the last 30 years. And it's the dynamics of how much of a population change that I think is a lot more important to be concerned about than, okay, we used to have 5 populations here, now we've got 4 populations. It doesn't excite me that much.
If we could thank Dr. Moody again.
All this enthusiasm here, I just want to point out the Department of Natural Resources has free booklets get MP3s of all the different calls of the frogs, and you could do that now, and you could go out the next warm night, you could be by Stroud's Run, and you could be identifying
Bike path?
all the
The
different.
bike path is really good.
Yeah, yep, bike path.
Over by Eclipse.
Yeah. And yeah, the bike, just here, like the bike path, farther out Stroud's Run, all the way out to Zaleski. There's just, it's gonna be great.
Just-
And I'm
just-
sure Scott will let you guys
Oh,
know
yeah.
some more. And
Yep,
answer
you wanna
more
come up?
questions. Thank you, and cafe conversation
All right.
next week.